All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on job analysis, crafting job descriptions that pop. My name is Mackenzie Keller with the CSG Pool, and I'm joined by Senior Consultant for CPS HR, Geoff Burcaw. Today, we'll be learning about what job analysis is and how to translate that knowledge into an effective job description. As a reminder, you're welcome to use the chat to ask questions, and we'll have a chance for Geoff to answer those questions at the end. If you need to step away for whatever reason, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent out to participants shortly afterwards so that you can always go back and watch anything you missed. With that, Geoff, I'll leave it up to you.
All right. Thanks, Mackenzie. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, and thanks for joining me. And thanks for those of you who have introduced yourself in the chat. You don't have to do that, but it's always nice to just say hi and like to know who's in our room, our virtual room here. So crafting job descriptions that pop, what does that mean? Really, what I'm going to be talking about is making sure that your job descriptions are really, really accurate, that they really, really reflect the job and really define all of the requirements for the job. And the way that we do that, the way that we make sure that our job descriptions are really accurate and up to date is through some kind of a job analysis process. And you may or may not be familiar with job analysis. It might be something you you do all the time or something you've never even heard of, but I'll do kind of a brief overview. I can't really go into it, but just I'll let you know right now, job analysis is a way of studying a job to identify the work that's performed and what it takes to be successful in that job. And so it's a perfect way to get the information that we need for our job description. So I'm going to be talking about how to take the information from our job analysis and translate that into the language of a job description. Just very, very briefly, I just want to say a couple things about our company, CPS HR Consulting. We've been around for over 40 years now. We are actually based in California. We're a California Joint Powers Authority, and that means that we're a self-supporting public agency. And so we're governed by a board of directors that consists of people at the top positions in various other public sector agencies, state agencies, and local government all over the country. And so, according to our charter, we are only to work with public sector entities. And so, what that means is we have kind of a unique expertise and experience in the public sector. And so, those of you, if you've worked in both private and public sector, you know that public sector is very specialized, very different, and takes a certain amount of expertise. Currently, we have over 100 full-time employees doing all kinds of things in the area of recruitment and selection and organizational strategy, training and development and investigations and on and on. So we do all kinds of stuff. About me, I'm Geoff Burcaw, Geoff with a G. I'm one of those weird ones. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from University of California, then a master's degree in industrial and organizational psychology from Colorado State University. Industrial and organizational psychology, or IO psychology, if you don't know, is basically taking psychology and applying it to the workplace. And so it's a lot of measuring people and their attributes and predicting job performance and being able to learning how to select the best people for jobs based on those different attributes. So I've been doing this for over 20 years now as a human resources consultant, and 18 of those years here at CPS HR Consulting. And we are truly nationwide. Our company is nationwide, but I happen to be based in the beautiful state of Colorado. So that's just really brief about me. I want to jump right in because there's so much stuff I want to tell you. And I apologize in advance for talking fast. But again, like Mackenzie said, if you have questions, put those in the chat. If I can get to those while while I'm talking, I'll try to do that. But if not, we'll have some time at the end for questions. So I want to talk about job descriptions themselves and kind of remind you of what they are. If you don't deal with job descriptions regularly, just a reminder that they basically contain all of the information that we have about a given job. So it's the what I call the three R's, the role, responsibilities, and requirements. So everything that a person does in a particular position, all the requirements, what it takes to be minimally qualified for the position, all of that stuff. And I'm gonna go through all of those elements. A really important aspect of a job description is that it communicates to employees what the responsibilities are of a particular position, and it communicates our expectations of those employees, as an organization. So it basically tells them everything that you need to do. It's kind of in a way, it's an employment contract of sorts because you're saying you do all of these things that are listed here, and we will pay you X amount of money, and that's the deal. And of course, we always hear or we sometimes hear about people complaining that they're doing things that aren't in their job description. So meaning there's maybe a violation of that employment contract kind of thing. So very, very important that our job descriptions are really, really accurate. And also because they generally establish our screening criteria and our selection criteria. We establish our minimum qualifications for a particular job, and we use those for screening applicants and all of that. So super important. Let's break it down a little bit, though, and talk about the elements, typical elements of a job description. Um, your job descriptions may vary a little bit, but in the public sector, I have found that they generally contain these different elements. There's usually, and in a few minutes, I'll go over these in greater detail, but just kind of as an overview. There's usually some kind of a definition of the job, sometimes called purpose, why the job exists, and just sort of a real broad overview of the job. Some kind of distinguishing characteristics. So what sets this job apart from other jobs in a hierarchy? The amount of supervision that's either received or that exercise, who you're supervised by and who you supervise if you do. And then very important, when we're talking about job analysis and taking that information from the job analysis and putting that into a job description, we've got our duties or functions or essential functions. So descriptions of the most important work that's done on the job. And then we'll often have marginal duties or other duties. So other things that people have to do or may have to do, but they're not quite as important. And then we've got our minimum qualifications. So we want to specify what kinds of knowledge and skills and abilities people have to have at a minimum to do the job. And there's probably some kind of statement of education and experience that we're requiring at a minimum to be considered as an applicant for the job. And then we might even have what we call desirable qualifications or preferred. So these aren't things that are needed at a minimum, but if people had those, it would make them a better performer. And so we might want to select people who had those extra things. So if you don't work with job descriptions regularly, you may not really think about this, but where does this information come from? Um, it's really important that, like I said, that we make sure that our job descriptions are really accurate and completely up to date. But how do we make sure that we have the most important we've identified the most important duties and we have the most accurate minimum qualifications and all of that. Well, it comes from the place where so much information that we need in human resources comes from, and that is from job analysis. A job analysis of some method. And job analysis is kind of a broad term for studying a job to identify the work that's performed. But basically, the idea with a job analysis is that it's a systematic study. So we don't just look at some documentation of the job and we see a list of things that people perform on the job and we assume that that's it. We go out and we gather lots of information in a fairly rigorous process. So there are two aspects to a job analysis generally. One is to figure out what is the work that's performed in the job. So we identify all of that, the work behaviors, and we usually break that down into individual job tasks and then the qualities that someone should possess in order to be able to perform those tasks successfully. And we usually think of those in terms, at least at a minimum, in terms of knowledges and skills and abilities. And Another important aspect of job analysis is that it combines this data from all positions in a particular job and figures out what is most common across all of those positions. So, for example, if we are looking at the job of administrative assistant and we have 10 administrative assistants in our organization, we're going to gather information about what all 10 of those people are doing and what it takes to be successful in their job. And we're going to look at what's common across all of those positions so that we can really describe the job as a whole. So we're not looking at those individual positions, but we're looking at the job as a whole. And the end goal in our job analysis is to end up with a big long list of all of the tasks that are performed on the job and an indication of how important each one of those tasks is. Let's say, we break down a job into 30, 50, or 100, or even more tasks. So we're going to have a big long list of those. But as you know, not everything that we do on our job is as important as everything else. Some things that we do are absolutely critical. So if we didn't perform those tasks or we didn't do those correctly, we would kind of be failing at our job. We wouldn't be really doing our job. So some of those are going to be critical, but some of those are things that we do, but they're maybe not as important, or they're important, but we don't do them very often and that sort of thing. We're also going to end up with a big long list of all of the knowledges and skills and abilities that are needed for performing the job, and then how important each one of those is. Because, like the tasks, not everything is critical. Some knowledges or skills you absolutely have to have in order to be able to perform the job. So if you didn't have those, you'd be failing at the job. So those are critical. But some are, you know, maybe very important or just somewhat important. Like it's nice if you have those. You might be a little bit better at the job, but not absolutely critical. So we're going to end up with, again, two big long lists of, we're going to have a list of tasks and a list of KSAs, and then a bunch of data related to how important they are. And we start by working with subject matter experts to develop these tasks and KSAs. Um, it's really important that we use subject matter experts in doing our job analysis, in developing our task and KSA statements, and gathering all of our data. We don't want to just sit back in HR and just imagine what it is people do all day and what it takes to be successful. We want to actually go out and work with the people who are doing the job day in and day out or supervising it very, very closely. And so what we're going to end up with is a big long list of tasks, like I said, and tasks look something like this. And this is a very abbreviated list. Imagine this is sort of the first of many pages. So this is just 7 tasks. We would have many, many more. In fact, as many as it takes to fully describe everything that's done on the job. But for illustrative purposes here, I'll show you, these 7. So you can see these important tasks: research policies and state laws and local ordinances using different sources, reviewing forms and applications and correspondence. Number 3 is reviewing forms and applications and filings. But you'll notice that some of these might seem kind of redundant. Like number 2 and number 3 are both about reviewing materials for different reasons. But the whole idea of job analysis is to break down the job into all of those individual little tasks. So you can see that number 2 is reviewing this material to make sure that to obtain the information that you need for analyses. Number 3 is reviewing materials to make sure that you have all of the information. So they're very, very similar, but slightly different. And that's the whole idea of job analysis, is to break down the job into all of those individual components and figure out exactly what is most important. And then, like I said, we're going to end up with a list of our KSAs, so our knowledges, our skills, and our abilities. And this is, of course, an abbreviated list, and we would have many, many more. But the assumption is that all jobs, no matter what the work is, all jobs require a certain amount of knowledge and some kind of skills and abilities. No matter how simple the job is, there's going to be something there. So you can see that we've got things like some broad things: knowledge of general accounting principles and procedures, knowledge of basic statistics, and then those are fairly broad. And then number 3, knowledge of methods of estimating depreciation, so a real specific one. So we get a real variety of knowledges and skill to do various things. skill to identify the information that you need, skill to compile numerical data from multiple sources, and so on. But we still don't know which of these are most important. So we start out again with you working with subject matter experts to come up with these big lists of all the potential the potential important tasks and all of those KSAs and everything. But now we need to figure out which ones really are most important. And we're going to get that information from subject matter experts, typically incumbents and supervisors. We want to get that information from, you know, at least from people who are performing the job on a daily basis. They're going to be most knowledgeable about the job, but also people who are supervising it very closely. So we're going to generally we do some kind of a survey process. We'll give people those lists of all the tasks and KSAs, and then we have them rate them on various rating scales. And I won't go into all the various different rating scales. There's lots of different uh, methodologies for doing job analysis and for gathering this information. But the important thing is to get some kind of indication of how frequently the tasks are performed on the job and how important the tasks are, and then average that across all of your subject matter experts or all of the positions. And then to get ratings on the KSAs, how important each KSA is. And then, very important, if that KSA is needed upon entry into the job or needed upon hire. That's going to be really, really important information for developing our minimum qualifications. Only going to develop minimum qualifications based on KSAs that are needed upon hire and very important. So what we're going to end up with is results that look something like this. So this is that same task list, but now we have an indication of the frequency with which each one of these tasks is performed. So maybe, daily to weekly or every single day, or maybe only weekly to monthly. So these different ranges. And then we have an indication of how important each one of these tasks is. So you can see some are critical, some are very important. One of them is just important. A couple of them are only somewhat important. And so we have a lot of information here. We can get a really good idea of how people are spending their time, which things take up, most of their time, which things are absolutely critical. So if they didn't do certain tasks or didn't do those well, they would be sort of failing at the job. But then other things where, if you didn't really do something like number 4, reviewing maps, only done every, monthly to every few months and not very often, it's only considered somewhat important. So you could say that, if someone really didn't have much of an ability to do that, they weren't very good at it, it wouldn't have major consequences for the job, unlike some of these other things that are critical. And then our KSA results, we're going to have an indication of, on average, how important that particular KSA is. So some are critical, some are very important, some are just important. We could even have some that are considered just somewhat important or not very important at all. And then, very importantly, an indication of if a particular KSA is needed upon hire or needed upon entry into that particular job. And so what we're going to look for is things that are absolutely critical for performing the job and very important for performing the job. And we're going to use that for various different things. And particularly anything that's important or critical and needed upon hire. Those are things we can use for selection. So selecting candidates. We don't want to select based on anything that's not needed upon hire that people could learn once they get in the job, but we're going to really focus on those things that are most important and needed upon hire. And again, for developing our hiring processes, and developing our minimum qualifications, which I'll talk about a little bit. So we have lots and lots of information now from our job analysis. So now what do we do? Now how do we take that information and we translate it into our job description? Uh, Now some of it is kind of obvious, like in our definition, our distinguishing characteristics, and the amount of supervision and whatever. And that's just a matter of working with subject matter experts and having them help you define the job and all of that. But I'm talking really about when we get down to the duties and functions and which ones are essential functions, and then which ones are marginal duties, and then the qualifications. which ones are desirable and which ones are the minimum versus desirable. And so what makes a function essential? So I'm going to be talking about that, and what makes a duty or a function marginal, um, or minimum qualification versus desirable qualification. And too often, I think it's just based on sort of speculation or just kind of a judgment. Like we think that these are probably the most important things, or some manager says, yeah, these are the most important things in the job, so consider these essential. And, you know, minimum qualifications are often based on just sort of what we've always done. We always require 5 years experience doing something, or because it's an accounting related job, we'll just assume, well, they should probably have a degree in accounting. But that's not the way to go about it. The way to go about it is making sure that what you're requiring is absolutely job related, and therefore it's going to be based on our job analysis results. So we can take our task results, and based on our task results, we can figure out what are going to be our essential functions versus our marginal or other duties, and in which KSAs are going to make up our minimum qualifications, and which ones are going to make up our desirable qualifications. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. How do we kind of translate our job analysis results into that essential versus marginal, all of that kind of stuff. But I want to go back a little bit and talk about some of those typical typical job description elements. So the things that we see all the time in job descriptions. And just for illustration, I found I did not develop this particular job description. This is from some city for the classification of police sergeant. So just for serves as a good illustration. It's nice and simple, but it's got lots of information in it. So let's look at some of these typical job description elements. So typically there's some kind of description of the job, some kind of a very broad, sometimes called description, or sometimes called purpose, like the purpose of the job. And it's really just that. It is a very broad definition of the job, a very high level definition. And one way to think of it is, how would you describe the job in 30 words or less? Imagine your own job. It's kind of difficult. You would have to really describe what it is you do in very, very broad terms. So really in terms of overall responsibilities. Now, before I go on, I want to do a little bit of definitions here, because I've just thrown out a term, responsibilities. I've also talked about tasks, and I've also talked about duties. So what is the difference? Well, these are different ways of describing the work that's performed on the job. And the way it works is responsibilities, they're not functions or duties, or then they're not tasks. Responsibilities are actually the highest level of describing a job. So it's describing a job in the broadest terms. So responsibility could be something like, managing the accounting department. That's very, very broad, because there would be lots of different duties within that, and within those duties, lots of different tasks. So the next level down is functions or duties. And I use the term functions and duties synonymously because they typically are, usually agencies will use either one or the other, either functions or duties. But these are things that describe main areas of the job, and they fit within those responsibilities. So for example, if your responsibility is managing the accounting department, and a function or duty would be supervising employees within the accounting department doing various things or whatever. And you could break that down further into job tasks. And job tasks are individual components of a duty. So they fit within that. And later I'm going to show you, or in a few minutes, I'm going to show you that we need to take our job analysis tasks, and we're going to roll those up into functions. And as long as we pick the right ones, we'll make sure those are essential functions. So I'll talk about that in a second. But also within this definition of the job is usually some kind of description of what we call contextual performance, which is how the work is performed. So, do you work under close supervision all the way to general direction? And it's, close supervision is the most supervised. Um, this is sort of entry level jobs where you've got a supervisor who's working alongside the people, kind of guiding them as they work. Or just supervision is a little bit less. You get a little bit more autonomy. You have a supervisor kind of giving you instructions, but they leave you to, do your work. They're not looking over your shoulder, essentially. And then general supervision, even a little bit more autonomy than that. And then direction, you're not directly supervised, but you've got, a supervisor or a manager who establishes what it is you're supposed to be doing in your job, and they may check in with you once in a while to check on how you're doing, but you're fairly autonomous. And then general direction is the most autonomous of all, where you've got some policies and procedures and you understand the work that has to be done, but you've got enough expertise to know how to do the work, and you're kind of on your own to do it. So there's usually some kind of description of that in the definition or purpose. Let's look at what it looks like for the police sergeant. Under direction, okay, so there, right there that's the most autonomous level. So just under direction, they're not closely supervised. Coordinates and supervises the activities and operation of a team of police employees, program or function. So you can see this is very, very broad, describing the job in very, very broad terms, implements department policies and procedures. A lot of things would go under that. Lots of different duties would go under all of these different responsibilities. So kind of describing the job in 30 words or less, basically. Then we usually have some kind of distinguishing characteristics. And this is basically describing how the job is set apart from the jobs around it in a hierarchy. Is it entry level? Is it journey level? Is it first level supervisor, management level, that sort of thing? So looking at our job description, let's see what they've got. The police sergeant is the supervisory level class. Okay, so it's supervisor responsible for all of this stuff. Employees in this class supervise line level employees. So it's very important to say who they supervise. And then it goes on and says this classification is distinguished from the next higher classification of police lieutenant, and that is the mid-level manager. So now we know exactly where the police sergeant is. It's they're over the line level people and they're just under the lieutenant, which is considered the manager level. So the supervisor level is just below manager, meaning there aren't multiple supervisor levels and that sort of thing. So very descriptive. And we also, there's usually some kind of description of the amount of supervision received or exercised. We might have already said it in our definition. It could be a repeat of that, but it's really important to say who they supervise and if they and who they're supervised by. And often, so in this case, that was also in our distinguishing characteristics, but it's good to be really clear, really, really important, in fact, in a job description to make sure it is absolutely clear what the position does, who they supervise, who they're supervised by, and all of that. So sometimes it's a little bit redundant, but we can see receives direction from police lieutenant and exercises direct and indirect supervision over sworn and non-sworn personnel. Now, you might, in your job descriptions, have some kind of a description of the working conditions. So even the physical environment of the job, like works in a typical office environment or works outdoors in all weather conditions, or any other condition that could affect someone's ability to do the job. So not the tasks themselves, but the situation, the conditions within which they have to do those tasks. And they might not be able to do those tasks because they, can't handle that particular, situation, like exposure to noise and chemicals, and so various, hazards and risks and all of that. And we get all of this information, again, from some kind of job analysis process, but usually through direct observation. And usually for jobs like where if people have to work outdoors in all weather conditions and, among hazards and whatever, usually we go out and we actually observe people doing the job so that we can put those in our job description if it's important. One thing to note, make sure that employees actually have to put up with those conditions in order to perform the essential functions. Um, if they don't actually have to, then you don't want to tell people you have to. People might select them, and they might self-select out, saying, "Oh, well, I can't work in all weather conditions or whatever, or around loud noises or something, so I'm not going to apply for the job." But if people didn't actually have to do that, then that wouldn't be fair. You've made people self-select out. Maybe it's a condition where on, a day where there's bad weather, they could choose not to work outside, but they could do some kind of work inside. Then maybe they're not actually required to do that. And then really similarly, you might want to have some kind of statement of physical demands. If a job requires, anything really physical, standing, sitting, lifting, climbing ladders or whatever, ability to stand for up to 6 hours at a time, or to sit for 8 hours at a time, or to lift up to 50 pounds, or something like that. Anything that would be needed for performing this job that may be a little bit out of the ordinary. Now, most of the time with normal so-called office jobs, most of the time, I don't actually see a lot of physical demands in job descriptions. But again, if you have a job that's like, like a maintenance people or public works or something like that, where there is a lot of physical abilities, it's a good idea to get that information, usually through job observation, where you go out and you observe people doing the job to make sure that they actually have to be doing those things, because you also, like the working conditions, you want to make sure that people absolutely have to be able to do that if in order to perform the essential functions. For example, if you say must be able to lift 50 pounds, make sure there's no way that they could get around that. Like if they could have someone else lift that heavy object or whatever, because like the working conditions, people could self-select out. If they say, well, I can't do any lifting, I have a bad back. Well, maybe they don't actually have to do that because it's not for performing the essential functions. And then, and you might need to see if that, there could be maybe an accommodation for those people or whatever. So make absolutely sure if you're going to list physical demands and working conditions, make absolutely sure that people have to perform the essential functions under those conditions. Okay, now we're getting to the duties. This is kind of the heart of the job description, like really describing what it is people have to do. So duties, so like I said before, functions and duties, I kind of use that term synonymously. So what are they? Well, it's a segment of work that consists of multiple job tasks, sometimes known as function, duty, or sometimes called a work behavior. And there could be other terms as well. But the idea is they describe broad areas of the job, and they could be broken down into multiple individual tasks, like in the hypothetical job I was talking about earlier, where the responsibility is, say, managing the accounting department. One of the duties would be supervise employees performing daily accounts payable and receivable duties. That would be that would be a duty or a function, because it describes kind of a general area of the work, and you could break it down into all of the different job tasks that go into supervising employees, like coaching and training and planning the work and scheduling and providing performance feedback and all of the stuff that goes into supervising employees. You could break that down into those individual tasks. So because it describes a broad area of the job, there are usually, typically I see like 4 to 6 of these functions or duties, because they describe, again, whole, different whole areas of the job. But they should be developed from the tasks that we identified in our job analysis as being the most important. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute. But again, just to drive this point home, remember, a task is a component in the performance of a duty or function, whereas the duty or function consists of multiple tasks. So let's go back to our job description. Let's look at what they've got for essential functions. Well, they've only got two. Kind of interesting. Essential functions. So you can see the first one: accepts supervisor responsibility for activities, operations, and services, etc. Supervises and participates in investigative and field work. giving assistance to officers as needed, and all of that kind of stuff. So a bunch of sort of supervisory kinds of things. And then look at the other one below it, establishes or revises priorities, work methods and activities, the allocation of personnel. And so you're allocating resources. Well, that's sort of management related, right? So what they've done, apparently, again, only two functions. This is that police sergeant job with lots of responsibilities and lots of autonomy, and you're supervising people, and they've only got two functions. Well, what they've done is they've apparently taken all of their supervisory related tasks and they've rolled those up into a kind of a supervisory related function. And then they've taken what are kind of their management related tasks and they've rolled those up into sort of a management related essential function. So that's part of what you have to do in um, translating the language from your job description in or from your job analysis into your job description is being able to identify similar tasks and roll those up into similar activities. But I want to talk about the concept of essential now. So we know that we're going to take our job tasks from our job analysis and we're going to roll those up into functions or duties. But how do we make sure that that our duties are essential, or at least some of them are essential functions? So what does essential mean? So essential functions or duties are fundamental. They're fundamental to the job. One way of thinking about that is that work that's being performed is one reason why the job actually exists in the first place. So, for example, think of a receptionist job. A major duty of a receptionist is to greet visitors and provide information. So that's kind of why the job exists. So certainly greeting visitors, that's going to be a fundamental duty. So it's going to be an essential function of the job. If the receptionist didn't actually greet the people coming in, they're really not doing their job. There's going to be some kind of consequences of that. They're really not performing their job. It could affect other areas of the organization because the visitors aren't getting greeted or whatever. These are duties that are usually performed somewhat regularly, maybe every day or weekly or monthly, but they could be, fairly important, even if they're not performed very often. Or there's a significant amount of time spent on these, like, 50, 60, 70, 80% of a person's job is spent performing those particular duties. That that's what makes them fundamental. Um, so So when we go to our tasks, we go back to our job analysis results. Remember, we talked about this. This is all of our tasks. Remember, there would be more than this, but this is one page. And we have all of this great information about how frequently the tasks are performed and how important the tasks are. So let's take a look at some of these. We can see that we've got a bunch that are critical and they're performed, daily to weekly. So daily or almost every day. So we would probably look at some of these, like certainly the critical ones, we would want to look at those, or ones that are maybe very important but done every single day. So this would, on this page, these four would be really, really good tasks to take and roll those up into essential functions. You could say that because of these job analysis results showing that they're critical and they're frequently performed, or at least, regularly performed, we would be able to say that any duties or functions created based on these tasks will be essential functions. Well, let's talk about those other ones, those marginal duties. You might not have those in your job description, but it's a good idea because there are a lot of other things that people do, besides these four things or however many we had. There's a bunch of other stuff that people are doing with some regularity. And it's a good idea to let people know um, what else they might be required to do on the job. So these are, of course, they're not fundamental to the job. They might not be performed all that often, maybe only done every few months or once a year or something. Um, so imagine our receptionist position, and imagine the receptionist, most of the time they're greeting the visitors and whatever, but sometimes they have a little downtime and they do some clerical tasks, like they do some, copying and filing and things like that. Just it's kind of an extra duty that they have to do, but it's not why the job was created. So if they didn't do it, it's not really having great consequences. So they're not performing the job of a receptionist by not doing that, even though they're required to do it, not fundamental to the job. Something that, they could be assigned to other employees somewhere else. We have this clerical work that has to get done. Maybe we can find some clerks or an admin, position or somewhere else in the organization. They could do it, showing that if you take that duty away from the receptionist, you're really not diminishing the receptionist's responsibilities at all. And of course, they also should be derived from our tasks in the job analysis. It's not just other things that we can think of that maybe we want to, that maybe people have to do, so we should let them know. It should come from the job analysis as well. So it's going to be tasks that are maybe not as important, or tasks that are important, could even be critical, but maybe they're very infrequently performed. And so, of course, it's those other things, things that are important or somewhat important and performed maybe monthly to, every few months or something like that. But they still are performed. People are still doing this, so it is helpful to put those into our job description. So I want to talk now about minimum qualifications, because minimum qualifications are extremely important. This establishes our screening criteria and even some of our selection criteria for the job. Minimum qualifications, sometimes called job specifications, not which is different than class specifications, but generally, there are lots of different ways of describing what makes someone minimally qualified for the job. So it could be a bunch of the KSAs. Like at a minimum, you've got to have these knowledges, these skills, and these abilities. And there's usually some kind of statement of education or experience, a certain kind of a degree or certain kind of training or 5 years experience doing something or whatever. And then, of course, anything that's legally required for the job, like licenses or certifications, those automatically become minimum qualifications because it's legally required. Now, don't let the word minimum make you think that these aren't all that important. In fact, they are minimum because they are so important that people have to have these at a minimum. If they've got nothing else, they at least have to have these basic knowledges, skills, and abilities, or a certain amount of education and experience or whatever in order to be even considered as a candidate. And of course, when we're selecting people, we're going to be looking for things sort of above and beyond that, but this is sort of at a minimum. Well, and they need to come from our KSAs. So what would be KSAs? That would be minimum qualifications. And of course, you've guessed it, things that are going to be really, really important. They're going to be critical. And now this is key, needed upon hire. Absolutely needed. Day one on the job, you may have to apply that particular knowledge or skill to do something, or you're going to be failing at the job, and something that you're not going to be able to learn on the job quickly enough to get up to speed, to get to be, where we need you. And of course, the higher the level of the position or job, the more things are going to be needed upon hire. But so we can see that certain things like the first two knowledges, knowledge of general accounting principles and procedures is critical. It's needed upon hire. That should be some kind of minimum qualification. Knowledge of basic statistics, critical, needed upon hire. But some of these other ones, the next one down, number three, knowledge and methods of estimating depreciation. So kind of a very specific thing. It's important, but not needed upon hire, meaning people are generally learning that on the job. So again, we're going to take the most critical things that are needed upon hire, and those are going to be some of our KSA minimum qualifications. I just want to point out that it's really important. One reason why it's really important to use the KSAs that we identified in our job analysis for developing minimum qualifications is it helps us avoid ambiguity, especially using ambiguous terms or even buzzwords. Like, how often do we see things like this? Team player, must be a team player, or must be a self-starter. We see that in not so much job descriptions. We see that in job announcements a lot, and that's really not very specific. And we need to be a little more specific. And the problem is what we're trying to do with terms like this is we're trying to describe a kind of person that we want. And we never want to do that. We don't want to hire people based on the kind of a person they are, but we want to hire people based on their ability to perform the job. What actual attributes should someone have in order to perform this job? Well, a team player, what that really means is the ability to work cooperatively with others in a team environment. So team player means you just people like you. You get along with others. That says nothing about how you're performing the job. But this statement shows that you have to have it because this is the way we do the work. We do it cooperatively. We have a team environment. You have to have that ability. No ambiguity there. Absolutely clear. Or self-starter. What does that mean? High energy? I don't know. It's ambiguous. But what we're talking about, or what we might be talking about, is ability to take initiative. And the where people have most difficulty taking initiative is usually when faced with difficult situations, difficult decisions they have to make, or solving problems. We need people who can not be afraid to do that and to just jump right in and work on those. So ability to take initiative and making decisions and solving problems. So we've taken the ambiguity out of it. So just a reminder of why, one of the reasons why we use our KSAs identified in our job analysis. So think about education and experience too. So we can say, must have, these different knowledges, skills, and abilities, but we also probably want some kind of statement of people's background. So education and experience, but too often education, experience, qualifications are based on just assumptions. Because this is an accounting clerk and they work in an accounting department, we assume they should probably have a degree in accounting. But maybe not. Maybe that's too much. Maybe that's not really going to get them the right KSAs or a certain amount of experience. They should probably have 5 years. We require 5 years experience for most of our jobs, so we'll go with 5 years. How do you know 5 years is the right amount? And you can never assume that more experience means more qualified. I think we've all known people at some point in our lives who have 10, 15, 20 years experience and they're not even, or they're not any more qualified than some people who have 5 years or 3 years experience. So what you want to do is identify, of course, we're going to go back to our job analysis results and identify those things that we're looking at for minimum qualifications. Now, for coming up with education and experience statements, it's a good idea to work with subject matter experts, so people who perform the job and supervise the job, and ask them, okay, we need people to have knowledge of general accounting principles and procedures. What kind of education and how much education would have given someone that knowledge at the level we need for this particular job? Is it a degree in accounting? Well, maybe not, you know, but maybe it's a certain number of accounting courses. Maybe you end up with, they should probably have like 2 years study in an accounting program, so an AA degree, but it should be based on, again, exactly what education and experience would have given someone that knowledge or the skills to perform the job at that, minimally acceptable level. And so you would look at the skills too, skills, knowledge. If you want to know if people have knowledge, education's a great way to go, or training, certifications, things like that. But skills, the best way to figure out if people have certain skills is if they've done something in the past. So skill to compile numerical data from multiple sources, skill to review data, to assess quality and accuracy, etc. These are other things that we're looking at for our minimum qualifications. So think about experience. What kind of experience should someone have had and how much experience um, to have given them the skill to do these things at the level needed for our job. And you think about, is it a year, 3 years, 5 years? You need to, again, work with subject matter experts to figure out what is that exact amount of education and experience. But that was looking at the KSAs for developing minimum qualifications, but we can also look at our task results, and that can help us identify important things for minimum qualifications. Here are our task results. You remember these, and of course, we're looking at those things that are critical or very important and frequently performed. So something like the first one, reviewing or researching policies and laws and ordinances using different sources, done almost every day, and it's critical to the job. So that could be, we could develop a minimum qualification based on that, a certain number of years, in a job conducting research using multiple sources and that kinds of things. So remember, we're looking for those things that are absolutely critical. Again, work with subject matter experts, though. Don't just assume that because um, number five, reviewing property statements to obtain the information necessary to verify an assessment. Don't just assume because they do it every day and it's critical that they should have, oh, lots of experience doing that. They should, let's get people with 5 years experience doing that. Well, that might not be necessary. It could be a year. If you've done that for 1 year, maybe you know everything there is about reviewing property statements or something. You've got to work with subject matter experts to figure all that stuff out. But what about those preferred or desirable qualifications? So these are those things that aren't needed at a minimum because they're, maybe not as critical, but it's still good for people to have because it would contribute to job performance most likely. So keep in mind, these aren't just things that we can think of that are the so-called nice to haves. You know, they have to have these things at a minimum, but we also would like people who have these other things. They should be based on our job analysis so that we know that even if they're not considered minimum qualifications, they are still things that are required for performing the job. Um, so usually not things that aren't needed upon hire, but they are needed for performing the job at some point on the job. So it could be again, certain KSAs are desirable, certain education, experience, and so on. So things that maybe aren't as important, not needed upon hire, but it's really, really important that if you're using desirable or preferred qualifications to make employment decisions, so like to ultimately decide if you're going to hire someone or not hire someone, you have to be able to demonstrate that having those extra things would actually lead to better job performance. Well, a great way to do that is basing our preferred or desirable qualifications on our job analysis results. So we can see that our preferred or desirable qualifications, so that, above and beyond, that little bit extra that isn't minimally required, those are going to be those things that aren't needed upon hire, but we showed from our job analysis results that they are important or they're very important or may even be critical for performing the job at some point on the job, giving you evidence that someone who has those extra things, those extra knowledges or extra skills, would probably be a better performer on the job. And so you can also do the same thing with the desirable qualifications. You can identify different types and amounts of education experience that would indicate that someone has those extra things. Like, for example, that number three, that knowledge of methods of estimating depreciation, it's important, not needed upon hire, so it's not one of our minimum qualifications. But if someone had that, that would be good because people are going to have to learn that once they get on the job. So that could be used as one of our minimum qualifications. And then we might ask for, experience doing that, or we could say, because that first one was a minimum qualification. We said minimum qualifications, knowledge of general accounting principles and procedures. And then below that, we could say knowledge of methods of estimating depreciation preferred. So if you have two candidates who are otherwise equally qualified, one of them's done this estimating depreciation a lot, you might want to choose that one if you think that, and based on working with your subject matter experts, if that person would probably be the better job performer. Okay, so wrapping it up here, just some final thoughts. Job descriptions are so important for everything that we do in human resources because they are where kind of all of the information about a job is held. And often, very often, I see this a lot in organizations, there is no other information about a job anywhere else. It's generally not the case where there's some kind of a big file on every job in our organization. There's all this information about what people do and whatever. It's usually this piece of paper, this one document that has all of that information. So it's really important that it's accurate and up to date because, as you know, jobs change all the time. So we need to make sure that we're always keeping it up to date. And the best way to do it is using job analysis. So some kind of job analysis process where you work with subject matter experts. And the best reason for that is if you use that job analytic data, that's going to help ensure that any of those employment decisions that you're making based on your minimum qualifications or other qualifications in your job description are going to be valid, that they're going to be absolutely job related, that even things that are just the preferred qualifications, they are things that would lead to better job performance, and so you are justified in using those for your for selection decisions. So minimum qualifications should all be based on those, ultimately on those KSAs identified as most important and needed upon hire. And then you've got statements of education and experience. And remember, the key to those is making sure that they are ways that someone would have gained those particular KSAs. Don't just assume that someone should have a certain kind of education or certain amount of experience, but work with subject matter experts to determine exactly what kind of background that would be. And the same with your preferred qualifications. You want to make sure it's based on your job analysis results because ultimately you might be using those to make those final selection decisions. So it's got to be completely job related or to be valid and defensible. And then even those working conditions and physical requirements. So remember, I talked about how, you may or may not have those in your job descriptions, but if you do, if you're establishing those conditions for the job, you're basically telling people not what they have to do, but how they have to do the work. And make sure that those are absolutely accurate and based on some kind of study of the job, doing observations and whatever. Make sure that your job descriptions are absolutely accurate and up to date. And that brings us almost up to the hour. So I know I threw a lot of information at you very fast because I tried to tried to cram all of that in there. We do have a few minutes for questions. If you want to put questions in the chat, or alternatively, that is my email address on the screen. If you want to email me any questions, issues, comments, or whatever that you might have, feel free to take down my email address and ask me any questions about job descriptions, about job analysis, anything like that. So in the next, I don't know, in a couple of minutes, if anyone has any questions that you want to put in the chat, you can do that. Otherwise, Mackenzie, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, we'll give it just a minute or two for people to type out their questions. Again, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so if you had to step away for any reason or showed up late or anything at all, it will be sent out to participants afterwards, so you'll get a chance to go back and review anything you missed. If you're interested in learning more about CPS HR and what they can do for your district, then visit www.csdpool.org/HR-consulting, and it'll tell you a little bit more about their partnership with them, and if you're interested in their services, maybe how to get involved with that. Let's see. I'm not seeing anything come up in the chat at the moment. So if you have any questions, again, be sure to take down Jeff's email. Jeff, thank you so much for presenting today. It was very educational as always.
Thank you.
And I believe that'll be it for today. Thank you. Thank you all everyone for coming.
Thanks,
Have a good
everyone.
Tuesday.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Thanks, everyone.